All right, welcome back to Mr. P Helps with Calculus. This is Unit 3, and this is day number 6, as we're going to be finding derivatives of inverse functions. One of my least favorite things to do, because I don't know why, I just always forget the rules for this one. Skipping a couple of things. Well, first of all, let's talk about what an inverse really is. An inverse, as you learned back in like Algebra 2, just means that basically you're switching the x and y's in your function. So if you have an x of -2 and a y of 3, -2, 3 is the point, then the inverse would just be the same thing flipped around. It would be 3, -2. You're just basically switching the x and y. So we have two different functions. We have f of x and g of x, both using the same values of x. So if I'm going to complete the table for both f of x and g of x, that would be down here. 3, -2 and 2, 1 would be the inverse. That would be the x and y switched around. G of x, 1, -2 and -2, 1. It's just literally the same x and y switched around for the g of x. All right, find the value of f of g inverse of x. Now, you always do these from the most inside first. So in other words, let's evaluate this first before we figure out what f of that number is. So g inverse of -2, why I have an inverse table right here. G inverse of -2 is 1. We already did that. Or you could just look up the table and just kind of look at it backwards. I'll be honest, that's kind of what I normally do. G inverse of -2 is 1. Just do the same thing on the table going backwards. Now that we know this is all just 1, now all I have to do is find f of 1. F of 1 is 2. There's your answer. Boom, done. All right, f inverse of f of 1. So I would find f of 1 first. F of 1 is 2. And then do f inverse of 2. F inverse of 2, well, that's kind of silly because that's literally just going back to where I started, right? So f inverse of 2 is back to 1. 1 is my... So let's be honest. These two basically just cancel each other out. F inverse of, f of, those are just inverses of each other. So they just cancel each other out. Now, you can't say these cancel out because they're two different letters. So we got to do them each one at a time. F inverse of 2. F inverse of 2 is 1. So I'm looking here. F inverse of 2 is 1. So we know this is 1. Now we have to do what's G inverse of 1. G inverse of 1. This is G inverse of 1 is -2. And yep, that's right. Okay, this time we have 3. Remember, do the most inner first. G inverse of 1. G inverse of 1 is -2. All right, so that's -2. Now do G of -2. G of -2 is 1. Okay, once again, let's be honest. These two cancel each other out. We're literally just back to 1 again. These two are the same letter. G of G inverse. They cancel each other out, and you're left with just 1. F inverse of 1. F inverse of 1 is not on my table. It didn't say F of 1. It said F inverse of 1. So I'm looking right here. So that's D and E. It does not exist because it did not give us enough information in order to find that. So not really enough information to find that because there is no 1 right here. Okay, now we got the basics down of just what an inverse is. Now let's actually find the rule for finding a derivative of an inverse. And I know I started at the very beginning of this video. This is something I always forget because you just don't use it a whole lot. This is something that's just a pretty rare question. And I got so many things just up here in my brain I just have to memorize, and this is just another one of those things you just have to have memorized. This is the work to finding the formula for the derivative of the inverse. Now, you don't actually have to do this. The question says, what is f of f inverse of x? Well, f of f inverse of x equals x. Okay, if it equals x, then it differentiate both sides of the equation below. So they're giving us this equation, anything that equals x. If g of g inverse of x equals x, then it has to be differentiable. Okay, I digress. That's where this really came from. So what we're going to do is we're going to differentiate both sides of this to get the formula that we have to memorize. Well, if you look right here, it's clearly got chain rule. It's a function outside of another function. So we have to use chain rule. Derivative of the outer function is this. And then the derivative of the inner function, well, I'm just going to leave it like this for the time being. The derivative of the inner function. And then derivative of x is 1. Now, from here, what I did was, since this is multiplication, I'm going to divide both sides by this. So you get 1 divided by this. In other words, I'm putting all of this on the other side. So I get the derivative of the inverse of f of x, f inverse of x. So the derivative of an inverse is 1 over f prime of f inverse of x. This is literally the formula you need to have memorized. That is always the formula we're always going to use for finding the derivative of an inverse function, which you can clearly see that's how we solved it. Now, you don't need to solve it every single time you do it. All you have to do is be able to apply this formula. So here we go. The derivative of f inverse of 4, that's what it's asking for, is going to be 1 over f prime of f inverse of 4. That's literally this formula. So now the question becomes, what is f inverse of negative 4? Well, the first thing I should have done is find out what is this function. So it's negative 4 in for y. Notice what I'm doing. I put negative 4 in for y because remember it's the inverse of. And then I'm solving for x. So I found x is negative 2. So what that tells us is that, so by putting negative 4 in for y and solving for x, now we know what the original function was. The original function was negative 2, negative 4. That's the y and that's the x. That's the y, that's the x, clearly. Okay, so that was the original function. Now I'm gonna use that in the future. So here we go. Find the derivatives. That's 1 over f prime of f inverse of negative 4. I'm going to use it right away. F inverse of negative 4. Negative 4, f inverse of that is negative 2. So now we know all of this is negative 2, and that's what you see here. F prime of negative 2, well, that's what they gave us, which is 3. So now we know the bottom is 3, and don't say it's 3. You know, if this is a multiple choice question, you know the answer 3 is going to be one of the choices. The bottom is 3. It's 1 over. Remember, the formula is 1 over f prime of f inverse of x because it's 1 over the chain rule. To be honest, that's really what it is. Okay, one more set of examples. So we have find the value of f inverse of 3. So we're using the table. The reason why this is one of my least favorite things is because not only is it just memorizing the formula, it's very confusing, especially when they give you tables like this. I find it very confusing to ask myself, well, hey, what am I looking for exactly right at this moment? It says find the value of f inverse of 3. Oh, the derivative. Okay, I was about to say, where's the question? That's pretty sneaky there. So it says find the derivative of. So d dx, that's the derivative of f inverse of 3, that little prime symbol, is equal to 1 over f prime of f inverse of 3. Remember, it's just the chain rule. That's all it is, 1 over the chain rule. Okay, so f inverse of 3. F inverse of 3 is 1. So it looks like this is all just 1. So f prime of 1. So what's f prime of 1? 2. Okay, pretty easy right there. 1/2. Not too bad. Find the value of g inverse of... Okay, it's actually... See, this is what I'm saying. The way it's worded, I hate the fact that the prime's at the end. Find the value of the derivative of g inverse of negative 2. We're finding the derivative of an inverse. That was the whole point of this video. Well, find the derivative of an inverse, it's always going to be 1 over the chain rule, g prime of g inverse of negative 2. All right, just got to work on the most inner part first. G inverse of negative 2. Here's our g column. Here's negative 2. The g inverse of negative 2 is 1. So this is all really just 1. So it's now g prime of 1. G prime of 1 is 1. This is all 1. So 1 divided by 1 is 1, and 1 is our solution. All right, like I said, very easy to get confused, so be careful with these kind of questions, but I've kind of given you a couple examples of each type of question that you're going to see with finding derivatives of the inverse. Thanks again for watching, and I hope this helps. See you on the next video.